Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I call this story the 7-year mystery because it was incredibly mysterious for a long time, and it started with Holt McDonald Park.
Go for it.
All right. Well, I think the year it was probably around 1998, and is when I was first starting to learn about tracking. I was spending a lot of time looking for animal tracks, and this was in the springtime, I believe, and we had had a lot of rain, and then it had stopped raining, and things had dried up. And right across the footbridge on Holt McDonald Park, you hang a left, and there's like this trail that parallels the river. That's like an old dirt road. And along this road were all these like muddy areas that were perfect for finding animal tracks and sign. And it was like that super silty mud where you could see all the details in an animal's foot. Like I remember this one puddle had like a perfect raccoon track, like a miniature hand stamped into it. And then this another puddle had like tiny little mouse tracks where you could see all the toes, and even like a millipede had walked across, and you could see all the tiny hundred of feet on each side go along. So it was like
Wow.
captured everything in it. And I came across the strangest thing in one of these mud spots. He came up to it, right next to where there was the mouse tracks and the millipede tracks were the tiniest little deer tracks. They were measured 3/8 of an inch long, tiny little hooves, perfectly spaced out apart, like 2.5, 3 inches apart, like a 2.5 or 3 inch step. So if like you took my fingers and you put miniature deer hooves on them and walked them across this puddle, they just walked across the mud. And I could not believe it, that it was possible for a deer to get that small. And so I drew, back then it was before digital photography, so I drew them perfectly and took measurements of the tracks and the steps and drew the whole area, mapped out the area, recorded the weather, everything, time and date, just documented them as best as I could, up and down. And so I went back to my field guides after coming back in from the field that day, and I was just pouring through the field guides, and in the deer section it said the tracks of even the smallest fawns only they start out like 1.5 inches, and there was like no way that it could be 3/8 of an inch long. And it was really strange, and I had no idea, and I'm pouring and pouring through the field guide. And I asked another tracker friend of mine, I showed him the drawings. I asked him, he's like, well, you ought to check out this book called The Magic of Finhorn. And he had like a copy, and I looked at this book, and it's a book about like elves and fairies and such. I'm just like, this is not a satisfying answer for me. I need to do more research. And so I start to dig deeper into the field guides. I go into, like at the time when the only guides available was the Peterson's Guide, written by Olaus Murie in the 1950s. And I go to the back of the book, because in the back of the book he's got some weird creatures like insects and stuff like that, and crayfish and things like that. So I'm looking at all these like weird like non-mammal animals and birds and stuff to see if something made this mark. And I can't find anything until I get to the back of the book. It's like maybe page 356 or something like that. And you get to that back, and there's this little hand drawing, and it's a perfect match for what I found. It's a perfect drawing of the tracks I found. And I'm like, yes, I'm going to find out what they are. And I look to the caption underneath the tracks, and it says mysterious tracks. And I read the paragraph underneath it, and Olaus Murie in the 1950s found these tracks on the lakeshore of Jackson Lake in Wyoming. And he says, on a beautiful day, I came across these tiny footprints that brought up the imagination of ideas of miniaturized deer. And he says, to this day, I've tried to figure out what they are, and I don't know what they are. If the reader knows what they are, please reach out to me. I'd love to find out what these mysterious tracks are. And I'm like, oh my goodness. But then I'm thinking about contacting Olaus Murie and realizing he'd passed away decades ago. I'm like, shoot. And so a couple months later, I realized that one of Olaus Murie's students was still around. So I reached out to this other tracker who's written some books. And I said, hey, there's this mystery on page 356. Did Olaus Murie ever figure out what it was? Because I found the same thing in the field too. And I described these tracks, and this other tracker was like, no, I don't know that he ever figured that out. I don't remember him saying anything about that. I've never seen anything like that in my time tracking, and he's been tracking way longer than I have. And I was like, geez, I don't know. And so I called another friend of mine who's a tracker who's written some field guides, and he said, he's seen wasps land on the ground and collect mud in one direction and then turn and collect in the other direction. That might be able to leave a mark like that. And I looked at photographs that he shared of that, but it looked nothing like the tracks. The tracks I found were perfect miniaturized deer tracks, and what his were like messy, squiggly tracks of these wasps collecting mud to make their mud nest. So that wasn't really what it was. And I asked other people. Someone suggested maybe it's a partial track. So then I went back through all the field guides looking like what piece of a foot could make a mark like this. And I could not find any piece of it, like a bird coming down to land but changing its mind and just touching the ground with a couple toes or something. I couldn't find anything because it's not like I found one track. It's like there was a whole series of them. Like I had, I don't know, like 5 or 6 in a row, making a perfect, walking pattern. So many years went by, and I remember telling this story to some students I had many years later when I was teaching tracking. I said, the coolest thing about tracking is that you can't always figure everything out, and that you're left with these mysteries, and they inspire you to go and do research and learn more, and it's like draws you to further down and getting better at the skill. And so I had this one student who heard me tell the story of finding these mystery tracks I wasn't ever able to solve, and I said, look, in my tracking journal, like most of them I have cataloged by species, but in the back I have this section of mysteries. And this is one of the few that's always stayed a mystery. Most of the other tracks I've found over the years I'm able to then later figure out, put them in the right section. But these ones remain as a mystery track. And I passed around the journal I'd made. So if this happened in '98, I'm probably passing around this journal in like 2003 or something. And I had this one student, he's super excited about this mystery. And he decided he's going to go on the internet and figure this out because the internet now has way more resources. So he starts doing all this research on the internet. And he said, Jason, and he comes to me like, I don't know, like a few weeks later. He's like, I think I figured out what your mystery tracks are. And I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, and he had this printout from the internet, like a picture of an animal on this write-up. He's like, it's a blue duiker from Africa. Like, what do you mean? Like, well, over in Africa, they have 50 different species of hoofed animals, and one of them is like super tiny. It's like the size of a house cat, and I think it's a blue duiker. I'm like, really? And he's like looking at it. I'm like, well, they don't have any like measurements on tracks and stuff. And I'm like, well, they have a measurement on the length of the animal, so like let's proportion it down. So we measure the length of a deer, and then the size of its track, and come up with a proportion, and then we apply it to the duiker. And I was like, well, Luke, if we apply the proportions, it's still going to be a track that's over 1 inch long. And he's like, well, maybe it's a fawn of a blue duiker. I'm like, Luke, how would a fawn of a blue duiker from South Africa end up in Tolt McDonald Park? And he's like, well, there's all these wealthy people that go on safari. Like maybe someone saw one and was so enamored by it, like he paid some exorbitant sum of money to have one shipped over illegally. And then it escaped and ran around Tolt McDonald Park.
Oh my God.
And so I hesitantly put down underneath my mystery journal, blue duiker fawn with a question mark, but as like a possibility. But I still wasn't really happy about that answer. But like that was the best answer we had at that time. But it still didn't sit well with me. I was like, gosh, what is this thing? It is so mysterious. And so then we fast forward a few years later, and I think it was in 2005, because this is a 7-year mystery, and I was teaching a special kids course on Bainbridge Island, and we were all messing around doing different projects. We were building a shelter over here, and some kids were doing something on making fire over here, and then all of a sudden I saw a couple of kids starting to gather around this kind of like mud puddle area. And they're like, oh, that's so neat. And they started to like look at something. There's something they were checking out and looking at. They're getting excited about. And I come over to this little mud puddle. And as I'm looking at this mud puddle, my jaw hits the floor. As I'm watching this mud puddle, looking at this mud puddle to see what the kids are looking at, all of a sudden I see the tracks I'd seen 7 years early be created in front of me, right in front of my eyes. And I was just speechless, and then I started jumping up and down and yelling, and my co-instructors and kids had no idea why I was so excited about the simplicity of what we were looking at. But what we were looking at was in this puddle of water, the depth of the puddle was just perfect, just a few inches deep, and the bottom of this puddle was curved so that only the 2 longest toes scratched the ground every 3 inches, just these 2 little toe tips, and made perfect deer tracks in a walking gait 3 inches apart, but it was the 2 longest toes of the hind feet of a red-legged frog swimming across a puddle.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's what it was.
That's beautiful. Very
I really
good.
wanted it to be the fairies.
I know, me too. I was like, go back to the fairies.
I love that.